A good coach in baseball, basketball, football, volleyball, whatever sport you play, if you ever had a good coach, then you know one of the things that your coach hopefully did was to go over when you failed or when you lost the game. Why was it that we lost that game? What happened? What do we need to work on? What can we do to become stronger? But if I wish to boast, I will not be a fool, for I will be speaking the truth, but I refrain from it, so that no one may think better of me than what is seen in me or heard in me, even considering the exceptional character of the revelations. Therefore, to keep me from being too elated, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from being too elated. 3 times I appealed to the Lord about this, that it would leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. So I will boast all the more gladly all of the weakness, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am content with weakness, insults, hardship, persecutions, and calamities for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong. You may be seated. And I'll try not to keep you standing. I will tell you that I married 2 lawyers that used to go to this church, and they had to stand, that is, everyone that was there, the whole service, or that is during their wedding, because I forgot to tell them, you may be seated. Yes, I did hear about it from the bride's mother, but she was a good woman. Anyway. Will you pray with me? Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight. May your word be heard through me, and if not, through me in spite of me. Amen. So as we look at the gospel of Jesus Christ, we see that there are some unexpected changes and twists and turns within the gospel that don't always make sense. If I were writing the life of a hero of mine, I would want them to be victorious, and we're going to talk about how the gospel doesn't always come dressed in muscle and with majesty. In fact, more often than not, it comes looking a whole lot like weakness. Jesus himself said, my power is made perfect through weakness. And so that's what we're going to look at today. We know that Jesus would look or die like a criminal. He would be subject to scorn and ridicule. Now, this is not the sign of a great leader that would still be remembered today, at least in my mind, but it made sense to Christ. The good news this morning is that God doesn't wait for us to get our act together before he starts working with us. God takes us as we are and who we are, messy, and can do something mighty with us. God can transform our weakness into a witness to others. And if you need proof, then read through Hebrews 11. There are a number of different prophets and people who are part of what we call the Hall of Faith. Every person is given something, like Paul was giving a thorn in his side, but we don't know what that thorn was. We just knew that it bothered him so much, he prayed and asked God to take it away from him. But that was his form of weakness. These people in Hebrews, they had a variety of different things, like limps. Some had skeletons in their closet. Others were just confused. But it was through their weakness that God was able to make them strong. So I want to go through a litany of some people in the Old Testament and New Testament who had weaknesses, and yet God was able to work with them. There was a man who had a whole resume of reasons why he was not qualified to serve God. You see, he had killed a man. He had buried his body in the sand, and then he turned and he ran for his life. He ran to a little hamlet far, far away called Midian. And it was there he would begin tending sheep, for he no longer felt like he was useful to God. But it was God who would call him from a burning bush and say to him, "Moses." And Moses would say, "Who, me?" "Yes, Moses, you. I need you." And Moses replied to him with a variety of different things, saying, "Lord, I can't talk. I have this stutter, and I can't stop this stuttering. I can't speak for you. I don't want to go back to Egypt. You see, I killed a man there, and when they see me, they're going to kill me." But God didn't take that as, okay, I'll go to find someone else. But he kept working with him and working on him. God said in general terms, "Relax, Moses. I'm not sending you alone. Take this staff." It was a large staff. "And take this with you and watch what happens. You can't speak? Take your brother with you. We'll let him speak for you. But it's still you that they have to listen to." Now that staff that God gave him would part the Red Sea. He would make water pour forth from a rock when they were leaving Egypt. Before the Pharaoh, that same staff would turn into a snake and eat 2 more snakes, the Pharaohs. It's not bad for a guy who couldn't finish a sentence and who said, "I keep tripping over my own tongue." You see, God doesn't need perfect people. Perfect people are not what God is looking for. He's looking for people like you and me. Willing people, not perfect people. Are you willing to follow God? When you are called, will you answer? Will you go? In our faith, or it is our faith that unlocks the power of God within our lives. It is through his grace that we can turn our weakness into something that becomes strong. If we humble ourselves before God and we put our faith in Jesus Christ, then his grace will enable us to do amazing things. It is his grace that will help us to change people's lives. For God has the power to empower us. Amazing things happen when God gets involved. I'm talking about the miracles that come wrapped up in ordinary packages. If you're from Winnie, seems like a small place, just a little dot on the map. But any small town will do. What could God do with little you or little me? Well, you're in good company. In Bethlehem, that was, of course, where Jesus was born. It seems like an insignificant place, and it was. It became quite famous because God chose that place because it was humble. It did come across as weak. But it's through that weakness the strength of God would be seen by others. And so this would become the place of birth for our Savior. You know, when Jesus was looking for his disciples, he didn't get to go to SMU or some of these seminaries, to Harvard or Yale or any of these Ivy League schools looking for people that he thought would be the very best suited to carry out his mission, but rather he approached fishermen, a tax collector. And when Jesus died, the Pharisees, well, to jump ahead, he chose ordinary people. And I say this because Jesus can and does choose us to help him. The question is whether or not we will be ready, willing to follow, whether we can hear his words. Weakness didn't have the last word with the disciples. Something happened. They were able to go forth from that place in the upper room, and they would put together what would become the Christian church, not just in the Holy Land, but around the world. And today it's still thriving. And so weakness was made strong. You see, something did happen to those disciples. They were a bit afraid, but I don't want to get ahead of myself here. Let's go on to another. So Moses underestimated himself and what he could do for the Lord. But then there was Gideon. He was a revolutionary, or that is, he would lead a revolution with a trumpet. He didn't have sharp knives, spears, and a catapult and things like that. He would win for the Lord by simply blowing trumpets and marching around a city. And it wasn't a bunch. He started out with more than 500 men. And the Lord said, go back and look at these men, and I want you to pare it down to less. He pared it down to 200 men. He said, that's still too many. I want less. Came back with 100. That's still too much. Just over 50 men would march around with these trumpets at night, carrying these torches and saying, let the walls come tumbling down. And you know they did. Well, this man that led them, Gideon, they said he wasn't very tall. He was from the weakest family. He was from the youngest, and from the weakest tribe, from the weakest family. And if you're a son, you want to be born first if you want the good life, because you're going to inherit most of everything. If you're the last in line, say of 8 sons, you're going to get very little. And so the last son was considered the weakest, and that is who Gideon was. He was the youngest son in his family, from the weakest family and from the weakest tribe. And some say that God chose him on purpose so that others would know and see the strength of God. It wasn't in Gideon. It wasn't because he could, blow a trumpet. It was because God was with him, and God could do things that were miraculous. Samson. Samson was he was very strong, and a lot of his strength was found in his hair. But near the end of his life, when they were able to capture him, and they found out through Delilah that his hair was his strength, they cut it. And then the officials rushed in, and they put him in chains. And they kept him like that for more than 40 years. Now, when they had him chained up, they took a red hot iron and they poked him in the eyes so that he was blind. They didn't want him to be able to see if he did ever get loose. They could capture him, they thought. He was of no harm to anyone. But it was Samson that would be brought into this temple where they had a gathering of all the people in that country that were of importance. And when he was there, he asked, are they all here? He could hear them. And he said, take me to the pillars. And they took him up to the front. And with 2 hands, he pushed the pillars apart. And when he did, this temple, the whole temple, came down. And everyone there perished. It was not a pretty sight. But it was God's will, because these people were not doing God's will. And he showed his strength once again. Even though Samson was a weak person, considered weak, and could not hurt anyone. So let's go to the next one. We got Moses and Gideon and Samson, and now there's David. When David was just a young boy, he was not a tall stature. He was the youngest, he was the smallest. But we know that he would go up and fight Goliath. And because he had taken care of his father's flock of sheep for years, he knew how to run away, scare away bears and all kinds of things that could eat them, if you will. And as he was on the field, he swirled that rock around, and it landed in the temple of Goliath. Goliath fell on the ground. David ran up to him, took his own sword, and he cut off his head. And he held it up to the Hebrews, and they cheered. The Philistines, they ran. They were afraid. But a little boy who seemed so weak and frail was not so weak or so frail when God was working through him. And so then we see God at work. That was David. Now Samuel. Samuel was born to a barren woman. Very often women are taken into the household of a man where they would spend the rest of their life. And their children, however, had very little opportunity, not just for education, but to do much in society. But Samuel would become a kingmaker. He would be the one that would anoint the next king. And he had a little hope, though. Who was this guy? Well, God has been flipping the script throughout history, changing things, turning things upside down that don't seem possible. They become possible through God. And as we said, Paul reacted in the same way. He had a great weakness. And he said, God, take this away from me. He begged him, but he would not. This was a big step in his journey. You see, he would travel throughout the Holy Land and helping churches become healthy. And by writing what we find in the New Testament. Okay. Well, we talk about ancient history or biblical history about how God works with people in changing their world. He's still changing our world today. We can look at things like American history, for we know that God has been working in our country. If we have the eyes to see, then we can see these. Remember, Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky in a log cabin. It wasn't much of a place. He barely had any formal schooling. When he was a young man, he would go into town and borrow a book and then bring it back. It wasn't until he was much older that he got any kind of formal training at all. But we know that this man who seemed to be weak in some ways would become very strong. He would take our nation through one of its darkest hours. That is the Civil War. Then there was Martin Luther King Jr. in our time, in the 1960s. He grew up under segregation, and he didn't have any political power or wealth that came from his family, but he had a calling, and that calling is what would change the way we treat people of color. It would set forth in progress a Bill of Rights rights for people who are being mistreated. So if we're honest, there are folks in this very room who have been through things that we don't even know about. People who have suffered, endured, and are here today. You're here. You are stronger. And that's grace in action because God is working through you. Not because of something that you do or I do, but because God has the capacity, the ability to work inside us and change the world. I'm not saying that God is looking for the most broken person either. That is in this church, or if that is the case and that's you, well, congratulations. You're ripe to become part of God's handiwork. You're qualified. We are all qualified. Because God chooses the least likely, He eats with the outcast. He walks with the poor. He spends time with the lepers whom nobody wanted to spend time with. And they didn't want you to spend time with. Jesus would spend a week at a time with these people who had leprosy. They didn't understand it. He would heal the sick. He would forgive the guilty. Jesus made a habit of hanging out with the people in the world whom the world had given up on. It is a contradiction. It doesn't make complete sense. It's what we call a divine dichotomy. Strength comes out of weakness. Hope is born out of despair. Life comes through death. And that's how God works. And maybe that's where you are today. Maybe you feel like there's nothing left in your tank. Maybe you are tired, hurting, ashamed, or just stuck in life. Where do I go from here? The good news that God is still making house calls. God still takes broken things and makes them beautiful and makes them work His purpose and His will. God still takes weakness and makes strength out of it. So today, let us not hide our weakness. Let us offer it up to God. You don't have to say it to your neighbor, but you need to say it to God. Let's say, Lord, here I am, scars and all, help me. And watch what He does. So finally, I close with this idea that helps me, and that is a good coach in baseball, basketball, football, volleyball, whatever sport you play. If you ever had a good coach, you know, one of the things that your coach hopefully did was to go over when you failed or when you lost the game. Why was it that we lost that game? What happened? What do we need to work on? What can we do to become stronger?
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.